11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent, marking the end of World War I, the war to end all wars. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. On this, the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I and of Armistice Day, what we now commemorate as Veterans Day. In Europe, it's often referred to as Remembrance Day or Poppy Day, a reference to the poem In Flanders Fields by physician Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae. In Flanders fields the poppies grow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. With the continuation of wars, Armistice Day needed to become broader, to encompass the wider group of men and women who wore the uniform in service to their country. Having known both of my grandparents who served in World War I, they believed their service was in the cause of preserving democracy and making a better world. And so it is appropriate for us to honor all of those who served. Those in the audience who are current or former military, would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you for being here and thank you for your service. Our speaker today is both former military and a Hawkeye. Thomas Tudor is a graduate of the University of Iowa, as well as a member of the Theodore Roosevelt High School Alumni Hall of Fame in Des Moines, Iowa. He served as a sentinel, then relief commander, of Arlington's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from February 1969 to May of 1970. He is past president of the Society of the Honor Guard, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and is a member of the board. Arlington National Cemetery is America's most sacred burial site, visited by more than 4 million people from all parts of the globe. Tudor has presented his talk to hundreds of organizations, providing information and perspective on the significance and meaning of this national treasure. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Thomas Tudor.
All right. Today is sort of the end of about a 2-week trip that I've made, which included a reunion of Tomb Guards. We met at the Holiday Inn in Key Bridge, Roslyn. Some of you may know exactly where that is, especially if you were stationed in the D.C. area. It's that it was, at the time when I was there, the tallest hotel on that side of the river, on the Virginia side of the river, and it's still in operation, and they still give us a heck of a rate. It's not as cheap as it was then, but it's $95 a night, and we had about 180 of us there to gather and tell stories, to gather and on the last day that we're there, we all walk up the path from the right side of the tomb, if you're familiar with the tomb at all. We walk up the path from the right in groups of 4, and we come to the center, and each of us has a red rose. And we get to walk across the mat and lay a red rose, either at the World War II or the Korean Unknown's grave. And there are a few guys that get a little teared up because they recall their hot days and long cold nights protecting this place from those who would disrespect it or do it harm. And I am one of those lucky ones who got to do that job. Before I begin telling that story, I'm going to talk a little bit about that special day in that special morning of the 11th of November of 1918. Now we sort of forget because of how quickly the Second World War occurred on the heels of the war to end all wars, what a horrific slaughter it was. The United States of America lost 116,000 men in that war. And in addition to that, we lost 430 nurses, 296 of whom are buried in Arlington National Cemetery in Section 21, which is the nurses section. But 63,000 battle deaths and 53,000 other deaths, and most of those other deaths were attributable to the Spanish flu of 1918. Now it's called the Spanish flu for a reason. It didn't come from Spain. It originated in Haskell County, Kansas, with a farm kid. It was a bird flu. And he took it to Fort Riley, to Camp Funston, which was part of the Fort Riley campus. And from there it went across the ocean. And the first wave was not particularly virulent. The second wave was the most virulent of the three waves. And it killed young, healthy soldiers and young, healthy people worldwide. 20 to 25 million of them. And of course, many of them in the United States as well. But to the Europeans, the generation of men born in the 1890s was called the lost generation. Because if you were born in any European country that was a combatant in that country, in that war, pardon me, your chances of seeing your 25th birthday were not good. Now, we lost 116,000. That was about 0.1% of our population. The French lost 1.4 million, 4% of their population. And if we were to lose 4% of our population today, that would be over 12 million. Can you imagine the national trauma that would be if we had a conflict where 12 million of our military were killed? We don't have 12 million in our military. That would be just horrific. The Brits lost nearly 900,000. And of those 900,000, approximately 400,000 were MIA, missing in action. No dog tags, no body, no bones, no nothing to repatriate to the family, to bury, to have a place to go, to mourn the loss of that person. And that is why, on the second anniversary of the armistice, the Brits and the French, on the same day, the 11th of November of 1920, interred unknown soldiers on their own turf. And the Brits did theirs at Westminster Abbey. And it is called the Tomb of the Unknown Warrior. The French did theirs beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris and put an eternal flame on that grave. And that eternal flame, of course, was Jackie Kennedy's inspiration for the eternal flame that she chose to put on President Kennedy's grave. And for 3 weeks before I was assigned to the tomb, I had temporary duty at the Kennedy grave site. And that was a very somber place because Bobby was there. And Bobby had just been killed about 6 months prior to my being there. And a very emotional place. Of course, the tomb itself is a very emotional place. And I'll tell some of those stories in a bit. But the Great War, and it was actually called, some journalists called it the First World War. They didn't call it World War I, but they call it the First World War because it was the first truly worldwide conflict. And so there are instances of journalists calling it the First World War. And the First World War ended, finally, officially, on that day. Now, the 11th hour was not the day that, or not the time that the documents were signed. The meeting was at 5 a.m., where the agreement was made to end the war, and the documents were signed sometime between 5:12 and 5:20 a.m. aboard this railroad car. And this railroad car was the field headquarters of this man, Ferdinand Foch. And so he would be living basically in the lap of luxury while his American and British counterparts were living in tents near the battlefront. He was in his rail car. But he had his rail car brought to the Compiègne Wood, 47 miles north and east of Paris, for the signing of the documents. Now, 2 days before, the Kaiser had abdicated and vacated to, I believe, Denmark. And so I believe this is the German representative, because he's the only civilian. He is not wearing military dress. There were no Americans there that day. There were only Germans, Brits, and French. And they signed between 5:12 and 5:20 a.m. the documents that led to the cessation of hostilities later that morning at 11 a.m. Paris time. Of course, that would have been probably in the wee hours here, but at 11 a.m. Paris time, the fighting was to stop. And there were stories of artillery being launched just before, so that it would actually impact before 11 o'clock. Okay, there was an American soldier named Gunther, last name Gunther, who was the last American killed just moments before 11 a.m. That would be quite a distinction to be the grandson of the last American to die in the Great War. Of course, and if you are from Des Moines area, you know that Merle Hay Road was named for the first first Iowan. I believe the first Iowan killed in the Great War was Merle Hay. So the Merle Hay Mall, Merle Hay Road was named in his honor. But we cannot forget how dramatic that war was for those who were in the middle of it. Of those 1.4 million French soldiers who died, that's just a huge number for a nation of probably at the time around 30 million or less, and of course 900,000 for Britain being about the same population. We lost 116,000, and our population was just under 100,000 at the time. So right around 1/10 of 1% of our population was killed in that war. So the end of it was a big deal, and was observed. And the Brits and the French wear a different poppy. And I was given one because I spoke at the Gerald Ford Library on Tuesday, and Elaine Didier, who is the director there, is a Rotarian. I'm also a Rotarian. And so she said, would you speak to the Ann Arbor Rotary Club? And I didn't wear my Hawkeye sweatshirt to the Ann Arbor Rotary Club meeting. I wore this to the Ann Arbor Rotary Club meeting. And I spoke, I did sort of a condensed version of this because, you know, Rotary, I've spoken to a lot of Rotaries as a Rotarian. You got to keep it to about 25 minutes or you're in trouble. So, or they're ringing the bell or they're walking out on you. So I gave them the brief version of this, but you're going to get the extended version a little bit here. We're going to try to go about 75 minutes and cut it off, and then we'll just do some Q&A at the end if anybody has any questions. But this rail car was made into a part of a memorial in the Compiègne Wood. There was also additional memorials made, and when Hitler defeated the French in 1940, he insisted that the French capitulate in this same railroad car at that memorial. And he instructed his soldiers to destroy that memorial except for the statue of Ferdinand Foch, which was allowed to stand. And in Hitler's little warped world, that statue was to witness the destruction of his memorial, to the French soldiers who died in the First World War. So this rail car was hauled into German territory, into Germany. And when Allied troops were approaching it, it was torched. It was ordered torched by Adolf Hitler. Some civilians salvaged some parts of it, broke off some boards or some pieces, but the rail car, of course, was done. But later, after the Second World War was done, that whole memorial was rebuilt. And instead of the original rail car, which was long gone, they found a car that was in the same production run as that original car, and they restored it to exactly the appointments inside that Foch had in his rail car, very well documented in his railroad car. So now, if they signed the documents at 5:12 to 5:20 and came out, it would have been pitch dark. And this photo would have been impossible. And I imagine they waited till the sun came up or got up far enough that they could take this photograph at the Compiègne Wood. But it was a momentous occasion. And Remembrance Day, as Colorado Springs residents, I'm in a Rotary Club in Colorado Springs, and we had some Canadian people from NORAD, North American Air Defense Command, in my Rotary Club, and they wore this beautiful red poppy. And this was actually, the reason I had this is because Ann Arbor Rotary Sister Club across in Windsor, Canada, had sent a bunch of them across because, and I really like these. I think they're much more dramatic, and much. The buddy poppy is of course, and I'll get to that story. And I think I thought I had one in my pocket, but it is not there right now. But everybody knows what the buddy poppies look like. They're the ones that are sold on the street corners, and I hope that the Iowa City VFW is doing their job and at least getting out and selling some on the streets of Iowa City in the last couple of weeks. But I remember buying them in Iowa City when I was a student there. But yes, as a 20-year-old soldier, I was given a huge gift. And I volunteered for and was selected to serve as Honor Guard Sentinel and then Commander of the Relief at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier from February 15th, 1969 until May 30th, 1970. Well, May 30th, 1970 was the last year that Memorial Day was by law the 30th of May. And that stupid law, the federal holidays law that passed in 1968 to take effect in 1971, that took Memorial Day from the 30th and put it on the last Monday, so you could go have a picnic or whatever on that day, or make that a long weekend to travel and see your family. But that's not. I'm not knocking traveling and seeing your family, but I think when you take that day and you dedicate that day to remembering those who fell, because Memorial Day remembers all who paid the full price, or who gave, as Lincoln said, their last full measure of devotion in service of their country. That's an important day to remember. And Veterans Day is important as well. But understand that it started out as the recognition of the armistice and the end of hostilities. And then, of course, in 1954, the same year that Under God was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. I remember being in kindergarten and learning it without it. And then having to relearn and learn to say Under God with the pledge when I was in first grade. But 1954 was the first year that the Armistice Day officially became known as Veterans Day. So it was the same year, 1954. Well, I got to be one of these guys. And that is I. This photograph was taken by the battalion photographer. And he was called out because this was a special day. It was the 4th month anniversary of my first ever walk on the mat at the tomb. And it was the first day I got to wear this piece of hardware on my right breast pocket. And it was a big day. It's a big day in a tomb guard's life, the first day he gets to wear the Tomb Guard identification badge. This is the second least awarded badge in the United States military. The least awarded badge is the astronaut's badge, and they're in the 200s, in the high 200s. So you have to fly into space with an American flag on your shoulder as an official U.S. astronaut. You can be aboard a Russian Soyuz capsule, but you're still an American astronaut. You have to fly into space to earn the astronaut's badge. to earn this badge, you have to serve at the tomb faithfully and without incident for 9 months. Now, this is the only badge in the U.S. military that can be revoked for as long as the owner lives. Of the 662 that have been awarded to date, the first one was awarded in 1958, 21 of them have been revoked for such things as felony convictions, and one unfortunate active duty soldier was busted for DUI going home from one of our reunions. He lost his badge because of it. So I'm sure he was rethinking that many, many times after the fact. I should have called a cab. I should have called somebody to get me home from this activity. But we are serious about it. We don't want anybody wearing this badge. Now let me turn that on its head a little bit. There's an email that started around in 2004 that says that tomb guards take a pledge to not drink, smoke, or swear in public for the rest of their lives. You know, my response to that is, you want the answer? Come to one of our reunions. Now, we hold ourselves to a higher standard when we are on duty and when we're off duty and when in our later lives. We hold ourselves to a little higher standard. But I will have this in my pocket afterwards, and if we're doing some mingling out in the lobby and you want to see it, I'll let you touch it. I usually don't try to pass it around in a dark auditorium. You never know what's going to happen to it. I'm sure nothing would happen to it here. You know, I love coming to Iowa. I love coming here. I live in Colorado Springs. And Colorado Springs is a great, wonderful place to live. But I love coming to where people are pathologically nice. It's always refreshing. Always refreshing to be back home. And in my heart, Iowa is home. I think I will spend the rest of my days in Colorado because I've learned to love that place for my own reasons as much as I love Iowa for its reasons as well. But this is the tomb. Beneath this block lay the remains of an unknown soldier from the Great War, the First World War. And I'll talk about how that selection process took place. But this says, "Here rests in honor glory an American soldier known but to God." And this tomb is cracking. And it has been cracking for some time. This is a 1969 photo. And I know a gentleman whose name is John Haynes, who was a Rotarian in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. I've spoken to his club several times. And John Haynes, when it found out in 2002 that the Army was going to replace the block because the crack goes all the way through, the Army decided in 2002 to replace the block, that my friend John Haynes called his friend who operated the quarry and said, "I want you to bring out a block about the same size as the first block for the World War I unknown, about that same size, and I want it to not have any impurities or fractures in it." And so he paid $31,000 for a block to come out. And that block is now sitting in the mill yard at Marble, Colorado. And I urge you to get there sometime. It's a beautiful place along the Crystal River. And I tell people you can't get there from here because you gotta go out to Glenwood Springs and come backtrack like you're coming to Aspen, and then you turn through Carbondale and Redstone. You go way west and come over through Paonia over McClure Pass. It's not easy to get there, but they have a mill yard, and that's where the tomb of the unknown soldier came from. It's also where this crypt cover came from, and where this crypt cover came from. This is the crypt cover for the Korean unknown. Now this is the representative in here of the 3,350 Americans who went missing in the First World War. This is their brother in arms who represents them all for those families whose loved ones disappeared during that war. And this is the brother, the buddy of those 8,000 who did not come back from Korea. hopefully we will continue to get remains if possible, and to identify remains from Korea. And this is the crypt cover, and this under here is the World War II unknown, the representative of the 78,750 who did not come back from the Second World War. No dog tags, no bones, no body, no nothing, just gone. This is the place where you go to honor those who disappeared in that war. So, this is the badge. And we have a motto in our society. The Boy Scout motto is be prepared, of course, we all know that. I think it's a Girl Scout motto too, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But our motto is soldiers never die until they are forgotten, tomb guards never forget. We also have something called the Sentinel's Creed that goes like this. My dedication to this sacred duty is total and wholehearted. In the responsibility bestowed on me, never will I falter. And with dignity and perseverance, my standard will remain perfection. Through the years of diligence and praise and the discomfort of the elements, I will walk my tour in humble reverence to the best of my ability. It is he who commands the respect I protect, his bravery that made us so proud. Surrounded by well-meaning crowds by day, alone in the thoughtful peace of night, this soldier will, in honor glory, rest under my eternal vigilance. And we who have guarded the tomb take that to heart. Now this poem was not written by a tomb guard. After a guard change one day in 1971, it was handed to the relief commander by a visitor who had written it. And this visitor had something in his heart and some understanding of our lives as tomb guards when he wrote this Sentinel's Creed. And I'll repeat this later at the end of my talk. But before I talk about the Sentinels and what they do, I'm going to talk a little bit about Arlington history, because a lot of people think they know it, but don't. A lot of people don't know it at all. But I'm going to fill you in. First person to own this property, on which the Arlington National Cemetery became a national cemetery. The first person to own the property was the ship's captain named Robert Howson. And Howson was given 6,000 acres of land across the Potomac River from what is now the District of Columbia. Now, that land from the northern boundary of Arlington to the southern boundary of Roslyn, about where the Marine Memorial is, the Iwo Jima Memorial, from about there all the way down the river to Alexandria, Old Town Alexandria, and including Old Town Alexandria, all of that distance and inland 2 to 2.5 miles. That was 6,000 acres. Can you imagine what that property is worth today? He sold it for 6 barrels of tobacco. Must have been damn good tobacco. He sold it for 6 barrels of tobacco. And it went into the hands of the Alexander family. 2 brothers, John and Philip Alexander, established Alexandria, Virginia in 1742. But in 1778, a guy with a famous mother bought 1,100 of those acres. And he's that fellow right there. Here depicted in a scene of somewhat domestic tranquility with his mother and his adopted father, George Washington. Okay? His name was George Washington Parke Custis. His father, Daniel Parke Custis, or her first husband, who was 20 years her senior, died in 1757, leaving her with 3 large properties of over 2,000 acres each and 300 slaves. That made her one of the wealthiest women in Virginia at the time. And so he found a well-positioned wife in terms of wealth. And so she was wealthy by many stretches of the imagination for her time and place. And of course, owning slaves, as repugnant as it seems to us in this day and age, was a pretty good measure of wealth. How many slaves you owned was a pretty good measure of wealth. So someone who owned 300 slaves had some clout, had some wealth in their portfolio. But in this scene, I'm going to say this is pretty soon after their marriage, when John was about 6 and his sister Martha Park Custis was about 4. Now that was in the era when they named daughters after their mothers. They didn't call them Martha Jr. They gave him a nickname, so her nickname was Patsy. So Patsy and Jackie were raised in the Washington household. So in 1778, when he was 24 years old, and he was a civilian aide to this man at Yorktown after the surrender of Cornwallis, he gets sick and dies of camp fever. And camp fever meant anything that killed you. It could have been malaria, it could have been yellow fever, it could have been typhus, it could have been diphtheria, it could have been any number of diseases that they called camp fever. But he died of camp fever after the surrender of Cornwallis, and he passed the property to his 6-month-old son named George Washington Park Custis in honor of his adoptive grandfather. Well, as soon as this guy dies in his 20s, Washington adopts his 6-month-old son. So Washington is then in his 40s, and he adopts a young son and sibling. So he's taken on some responsibility here. So the son, George Washington Park Custis, builds this house, and please remember that this was a slave-holding plantation within sight of the nation's capital until 1861, when the Civil War began. So this is a slave-holding plantation. You can see the Capitol building from the front lawn of this house. But so we had that slavery in proximity. Slavery itself was legal in the District of Columbia until 1862. And slave trade was legal in the District of Columbia until 1850. Well, I'll talk a little bit about this because I'm going to talk about this next slide. And this was the original borders of the District of Columbia, drawn in 1795. And it was 10 miles on a side, 10 miles square, 100 square miles. And it included Virginia. And it included Arlington, which is located right about here. And it included Alexandria. And in the 1840s, when the Virginians found out, they had given part of their land to form the District of Columbia. Maryland, Georgetown, Maryland was part of it here, okay? So when they heard that slave trade was going to be abolished in the District of Columbia, they petitioned the government and got legislation passed giving their part back. So in what was called the retrocession of 1846, Virginia got their piece back. So Virginia was now still here and still part of, in proximity to the Maryland chunk, but the Maryland chunk is what is now the District of Columbia. So, but it originally extended into Virginia. So this house was built by George Washington Park Custis, and he built it over a period of 16 years. It took him 16 years to finish. Not because he was poor, but because he was spending large amounts of money on purchasing artifacts that had once belonged to his adoptive grandfather, George Washington. And he bought this. He made this place to display those things. He had the tent, and he spent $4,000 at an auction in the early 1800s. That's a huge amount of money to spend at an auction in the early 1800s, buying stuff that had been George Washington's to display or put in his house. So, but he had 4 children. And only one of them lived to be an adult, and her name was Mary Anna Randolph Custis. And on the 30th of June of 1831, in the room right behind here called the family parlor, she married her third cousin and childhood playmate. And you may not recognize him now, but you will in just a second. Robert E. Lee. And of course, they were related three different ways: through the Carter family, third cousins, through the Randolphs, third cousins once removed, and through the Lee family, more distantly than that. they were related, and that was not uncommon in those days because you knew everybody because they had been populating Virginia with your forebears as well. So now this man, remember, served faithfully in the United States Army for 32 years prior to the outbreak of the Civil War. So on the 18th of April, 6 days after Fort Sumter was fired on, inside Fort Sumter that day was somebody baseball fans are aware of, Abner Doubleday. Doubleday was the first American officer to request permission to return fire against the Confederate States of America, and permission was granted by Major Robert Anderson. But 6 days after that outbreak, that first hostility, he was summoned to the District of Columbia and was offered command of Union armies by Francis Blair Sr., the Blair House, owned once by Francis Blair Sr., whose son Montgomery Blair was in Lincoln's cabinet. He was his postmaster general. And he was a family friend of the Lees, so he was asked to make that offer, and Lee couldn't take it because he was a Virginian first. His family went back to 1639 to Richard Lee, the founder. And in his family, two signers of the Declaration of Independence, Francis Lightfoot Lee and Richard Henry Lee. And his father, Light Horse Harry Lee, Henry Lee III, a Revolutionary War hero and three-time governor of Virginia. He was a Virginian more than an American. So he went back to the house, and that night, upstairs, wrote a letter of resignation to Winfield Scott. And why wasn't Winfield Scott asked to be commander of the army? Because Winfield Scott had gotten old and obese. He looked like Jabba the Hutt. I've seen pictures of him when he was just before his death, when he was morbidly obese. So Lee was the choice, the obvious choice, and he declined. And he resigned his commission in the army and wrote an eloquent letter to Winfield Scott and said, "I shall not raise my sword save in defense of my native Virginia." And he went off immediately, 2 days later, went to Richmond, told his wife to pack up the valuables and follow as soon as she could. Took her a few weeks. But he went to Richmond and offered his services to the governor of Virginia. Virginia had not yet joined the Confederacy. And so he had made his decision. Now in May, after the voters of Virginia vote to secede, just a couple days after, these guys come across and occupy this house. And this house remains the headquarters of what will become the Army of the Potomac throughout the Civil War. And they take the house. And the slaves, many of them stay and work for the Union Army. And one in particular, named James Parks, stays and works for the Union Army, becomes a gravedigger when Arlington becomes a cemetery in 1864 and digs graves till 1925. And dies in 1929 and is buried at Arlington because he spent his whole life there as a slave and a gravedigger, and got buried at Arlington because he was given by the Secretary of the War permission to be buried in Arlington. So this is Irvin McDowell. Any Civil War buffs in here? Okay. Irvin McDowell, of course, lost the first Battle of Bull Run and was replaced by, God help us, George B. McClellan. But you'll see something else with McClellan on it. And this man is the prime reason that Arlington became a cemetery. His name is Montgomery Cunningham Meigs. He was Southern born in Augusta, Georgia, but educated in the North and a West Pointer, and he hated Lee. And because he hated anybody who was educated at West Point and who fought for the Confederate States of America, he considered them worthy of trial, conviction, and hanging, especially Robert E. Lee. Now, he never got his way, but he got back at Lee by making sure that Arlington became a Union graveyard. Now, Lee never owned the property. It was always in his wife's family's name. People call it Lee's mansion, but it was never his mansion. It was his wife's mansion. And his son would get it back after the Lees are both dead. But Montgomery Cunningham Meigs, who was an architect, and who was not an architect, but an engineer by trade, the architect of this place was Charles Bulfinch, and this is what the Capitol looked like until the early 1850s, when they started redesigning, because they added the Senate chamber over here and the big new House chamber over here, and this little stupid dome looked silly. So they said, we need a dome that is going to be worthy of this building, and so this began the construction. This was Meg's project. And if you go inside, you see his name all over the place. He plastered his name everywhere he could, including on McClellan Gate, Meg's. Okay, this is one of 6 gates that was, or one of 5 gates that was around the original 200-acre Arlington. But it was at Meg's urging that Edwin Stanton planted the first and recommended to Lincoln that we make this land a Union graveyard. So the first military burial was May 13th, 1864, Private William Henry Christman of Pennsylvania. He died of peritonitis in the district in a hospital, was brought across and buried on May the 13th. The next day, Private William Black, first combat casualty, was buried at Arlington right next to him. And just to his right is a U.S. colored troop. And the early burials intermingled U.S. colored troops with white troops. But when Arlington became official on June 15th, 1864, the official policy of U.S. government cemeteries was segregation. And so they were separated. Blacks and whites were not buried together. But I was just on this hillside about 8 days ago. And this is what Arlington looked like at the outset. It was not a place of great honor. It was a place of great necessity. And you were buried at Arlington in 1864 or 65 because A, your family could not afford to have you embalmed and sent home in a proper casket, or B, you were unknown. I just read a book by Drew Gilpin Faust, former president of Harvard University. She's an historian. It's called This Republic of Suffering. It is depressing and sad, but it's about death in the Civil War, very enlightening. But it talks a lot about how few, 60% of those who died in the Civil War were never identified. Pretty remarkable figure. But these are not stones. These are wooden planks that are whitewashed and stenciled. They had a 5-year cycle of repainting them. And that wasn't often enough, because the freeze-thaw cycle around Arlington was just going to strip the paint right off these things. So in 1873, Congress authorized the use of marble headstones. And here is the Union Shield. Union Shield appeared on coinage in 1864 and 65, the 2-cent piece, the nickel. But this is USCT, U.S. Colored Troop. 180,000 blacks served in the Union Army. 1,500 of them are buried in Arlington, as well as 3,800 escaped slaves and free blacks who were buried as citizens. Now, this is a mass grave. And this mass grave holds the bones of 2,111 unknown soldiers gathered after the war from the fields of Bull Run and the routes of the Rappahannock. Their remains could not be identified, but their names and deaths are recorded in the archives of their country, and its grateful citizens honor them as their noble army of martyrs. May they rest in peace. September AD 1865. Now, where's my friend Robbie? Will Robbie come up and touch my hand real quick? Would you let Robbie pass the tripod there? Okay, thank you, Robbie. Thank you. Okay, thank you. You're done. Thanks. Robbie doesn't know it, but he has a living flesh and blood connection with the year 1866. Because the hand that he just touched held the hand of a man born in that year, and I called him Grandpa. My grandfather was born the year after the Civil War ended, in the year that these skeletal remains were put in a pit. Now, Meigs didn't just put them in a pit. It was a circular pit, and it was sectioned off, and he put all the skulls together in one section. And he put all the femurs together, and he nested the pelvises so they would all fit, sort of like a European model. But he was a little weird in my book. Okay? He covered them over and put them in Mrs. Lee's rose garden, so to make sure that the Lees would never wish to return to that property. That it was not necessarily haunted, but it had a mass grave in it, and that was something that people of that day would not want to have anything to do with. So, in 1868, General John Logan. And if you're familiar with the Denver area, the largest national cemetery in Colorado is Fort Logan. And that's in Denver. It has over 110,000 graves in it. And General John Logan was the namesake of that fort and that National Cemetery. And he was Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the great big organization on the veterans organization on the Union side. And it was at his proclamation that the first ever Decoration Day took place, and it took place in Arlington on May the 30th of 1868. And he chose May the 30th because flowers were in bloom from northern Maine all the way across the Union to California. So you could go pick flowers and decorate the graves of your loved ones. Well, Decoration Day became Memorial Day. And that day, May 30th, I think should still be observed. Okay? That's just my little soapbox opinion here, okay? But May 30th should still be memorial, in my view. And the first speaker, this was constructed for that event, and the first speaker was James Garfield, okay, who 13 years later would be assassinated, with Robert Todd Lincoln at his side, within an arm's length. Robert Todd Lincoln is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Of course, 1914, Great War erupts. And then this poem. And I'm gonna correct this, because that's a misprint. It's Poppy's Blow. And if you see the original manuscripts, and McCrae would very often, when asked, would write out the whole poem and give it to people. And he always wrote it with blow. Okay? In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the lark still bravely singing flies, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago, we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. And he threw the poem away, and a friend of his rescued it and sent it to the magazine Punch in London. And Punch published it in December of 1915. Now this was written right after the Second Battle of Ypres, capital Y-P-R-E-S. 5 battle spot for Ypres. And the Second Battle of Ypres was the first battle where Germans used poison gas in the war. 17 days of non-stop cannon fire, artillery fire, and machine gun fire. No break longer than 60 seconds. But McCrae sat down and wrote this poem after a funeral of a friend. And that poem got published in Punch in December of 1915, and it went viral. Anything could go viral. And it went around the world. And people around the world translated it to all the languages of most of the languages on the planet. But it became the inspiration for the poppy lady, Madame Guerin, who came to the United States and asked organizations. She asked the American Legion to adopt the poppy, and they did in 1920, and the next year they dropped it. In 1922, the VFW decided to pick it up. And then by 1923, they had begun producing the Buddy Poppy. And the Buddy Poppy, of course, has always been sold for charities and relief of veterans, especially then for the widows and orphans of those who died in the Great War. So, the Brits and French interred unknowns on the 20th of, or on the second anniversary of the armistice, on the 11th of November 1920. And so we did the same the next year. So, legislation introduced by Representative Hamilton Fish of New York. Hamilton Fish had been a soldier, had been an officer in the Great War. He had commanded an all-black unit called Harlem's Hellfighters. And he introduced legislation on December 20th, 1920, for us to inter an unknown. And there were 3 places that were considered. One was at the urging of Rodman Wanamaker, of Wanamaker's department store. He wanted him in Central Park to draw tourists. Another place was the crypt beneath the Capitol Rotunda that had been created to house the body of George Washington, but was never used because Washington chose to be buried at Mount Vernon in Arlington National Cemetery, right in front of the newly dedicated and constructed National Memorial Amphitheater. So, this photograph was taken on October 24th of 1921. And this is our unknown, having just been selected They brought 4 sets of unknown remains to this place, the town hall of Chalon-sur-Marne, France, and put them in 4 identical caskets. And the Sergeant Edward F. Younger, who was buried at Arlington, was given a spray of white roses and laid that spray of white roses on one of the 4 caskets, and that is him coming out. The other 3 were reburied in the Honor Cemetery in unknown graves. And so here he is, he's coming. And he's coming to the train, and there are the flowers used to select him, and that is John J. Pershing following. Pershing is buried in Arlington National Cemetery as well. And so here we go, cross the gangway, okay, to the USS Olympia, where you will be taken across the Atlantic Ocean to the Naval Gun Factory in the District of Columbia, and then from the gun factory to the Capitol, where he will lie in state. And this is William Howard Taft, former president, and then current President Warren G. Harding paying their respects. And then out of the Capitol to the caissons. These caissons are still in use today by the Old Guard, the unit I belong to, the 3rd U.S. Infantry Regiment, which has been in existence since 1784. So, here they are. Pershing is going to walk with them. And they walk all the way up Pennsylvania Avenue past, and then up M Street into Georgetown. And then they cross on the Aqueduct Bridge, which isn't there anymore. But why didn't they just go across the Memorial Bridge? Wasn't there yet. And one of the reasons it's there is Warren G. Harding got caught in a 3-hour traffic jam, and afterwards he said there's got to be a quicker way across this river. And that was according to some accounts, the beginning of the idea of the Memorial Bridge stretching from the Lincoln Memorial, completed but not yet dedicated, across into Arlington in 1921. But it didn't happen until 1932. So here's Harding presiding over the interment of the remains, and then here's Pershing dropping a fistful of French soil in on top of the casket. The bottom of this crypt has a layer of soil 2 inches thick from the battlegrounds of France, so that this American soldier is forever lying on the French soil that he died defending in 1917 or 1918. And the tomb was not guarded. This is from the Arlington historian, Tom Sherlock. One day in November of 1925, a soldier from the Great War, veteran of the Great War, comes out around the corner of the amphitheater and finds a family with a blanket spread out on top of the tomb, enjoying a picnic lunch. He chased them off and he went to the White House and got in and walked off the street into the White House and got in to see Calvin Coolidge. I explained the situation. Coolidge agreed and put a guard on the next day. And about 3 months later, March 25th, 1926, the United States Army took over. The U.S. Army has always guarded the tomb. I tell people I was a tomb guard, and some people say, oh, you were a Marine. And I say, I have the utmost respect and admiration for the U.S. Marine Corps. Bravest of the brave. Go where wise men, they go where you shouldn't. Bravest of the brave. But the U.S. Army has always guarded the tomb. There are one of 2 reasons. One is the Army is the senior service by a few months. Happy birthday, Marines, yesterday. But the Department of the Army runs Arlington. So that is probably another compelling reason why the Army has always guarded the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, because most of the national cemeteries are under the Veterans Affairs, but Arlington and the Old Soldiers and Airmen's Home in the district are run by the Department of the Army. In 1931, this was put in place. There you see the crack. Pretty significant. This one goes all the way through the block. And there are 3 wreaths on each side. These are wreaths of mourning. They are open at the bottom. That is a wreath of sadness or mourning. A wreath of victory is open at the top. A wreath of sadness or mourning is inverted. And so these represent the 6 major battles the U.S. fought in the Second World War. And this is a figure of peace with the dove, valor with the sword, and victory in the center, embracing them both. In 1937, it was discovered that people were coming into the cemetery at night with hammers and chisels and knocking pieces off the wreaths and figures to take as souvenirs. Midnight, July 2nd, 1937, a 24-hour guard was posted. The tomb has been guarded nonstop ever since. And I had the privilege of having 15 and a half months of that continuum, of making sure that nobody could do harm or disrespect this place. So, 1958, 2 unknowns were added, World War II and Korea. This is the Korean unknown, already selected in Korea, not in Korea, but in Hawaii, where all the Korean unknowns were buried, at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, also known as the Punch Bowl. So there were almost 900 of them. They randomly chose 4, and Sergeant Ned Lyle chose one of the 4, and that is him there. This is Corpsman William Charette choosing one of these 2. The Trans-Pacific, or the Transatlantic, I don't know which is which. The Transatlantic had 13 candidates brought to the central point in Epinal, France. One was chosen and brought to this place where the final selection was made. And 1 from the Pacific, 4 from the Philippines, 2 from Hawaii were taken to Hickam Air Force Base. And one of those 6 selected by Colonel Glenn Eggleston, a highly decorated pilot. And then they come to the U.S. Capitol, where they lie in state for 48 hours. They switch the caskets in the middle of the night. One of these is also the Lincoln pedestal, where Lincoln lay in state in 1865. They switched the caskets so each lay in the Lincoln pedestal for 24 hours. And then this guy gives them medals of honor. I'm going to be at his museum and library on the 50th anniversary of his death, the 28th of March of 2019. He died at Walter Reed on March 28th, 1969. And 2 days later, we were called out to open doors for dignitaries' cars at the Capitol when they brought his body over from the National Cathedral to lie in state in the rotunda. And the first door I get is the Shah of Iran. He's about 5'6". The next door I get is Emperor Haile Selassie, and he's about 4'10". The next door I get is George Romney. He's about my size. And then I get Speaker of the House McCormick. But when the ceremonies are all over, a staff car comes out from the east, underneath the east steps of the Capitol building with 2 red flags on it. That's a general officer. So Specialist 4th Class Tudor is going to salute that car. And as soon as I know he cannot see my eyes, nor can his driver see my eyes, I don't move my head, but I take a quick glance down, see if I can see who it is. And a feeble hand is returning my salute, and there are 5 stars on the shoulder. And there's only one person that could be, Omar Bradley. Returned my salute at his buddy Ike's funeral on March 30th of 1969. I'll never forget that day. I asked a bunch of 8th graders who this was. They have no clue. Joe Biden. I instructed them that this is not Joe Biden by any stretch. This is the interment. That's then Vice President Nixon acting as next of kin to the Korean unknown, and then Ike acting appropriately as next of kin to the World War II unknown. And so they will be lowered at our reunion. Our guest speaker was one of these 6, one of the pallbearers for the Korean War unknown. He was the only living of all 12. Still today, Ron Rosser, who was a Medal of Honor recipient from the Korean War. Now, this is President Reagan presiding over the interment of remains that were said to be unknown from Vietnam. I'm going to tell their story very quickly. Please note these 2 spikes here. I'm going to talk about them in just a minute. On May 11th, 1972, First Lieutenant Michael Joseph Lassie was a 1970 graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. I live 4 miles south of the academy on the west side of the highway in Colorado Springs. His wingman said he saw tracers coming up and go through the plane, and he saw the plane roll, trailing fuel, and no distress call. So he thinks Blassie was actually hit. And then no parachute, plane goes in, and then a fireball. So 6 months later, they get to the crash site, and what they find are artifacts consistent with an A-37 wreck. They find a rubber life raft, they find part of a parachute, and the only other possibility was there was a helicopter in the area. Helicopters don't carry life rafts or parachutes. Okay. So they were pretty sure it was an A-37, and they found 4 ribs, part of a pelvis and a humerus bone, and they found a wallet with Michael Joseph Blassie's picture ID in it, and local money. And the wallet disappears somewhere in the chain of possession with the money and the ID, and probably stolen because it had money in it. And nobody cared about the ID. Whoever stole it didn't care about the ID, about the identification of this soldier, of this serviceman. So, his remains go on a shelf. In 1979, they are retrieved, they are tested again or looked at again by another pathologist who calls their identity into question, and he reclassifies them X-26 from BTB, believed to be Michael Joseph Blassie, to X-26 unknown. Nobody knows about this except a journalist named Vince Gonzalez of CBS News and a POW MIA advocate named Ted Sampley. And Sampley and Gonzalez convinced the family that that is their son in this grave in Arlington National Cemetery, and they go through channels and get an order to exhume. And in May of 1998, this is May 28, 1984, in May of 98, they bring him out and they test him for DNA, and guess what? June 28th, positive results, yes indeed, it is Michael Joseph Blassie. He is now buried at the Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery near St. Louis, Missouri, which is his home. His sister came to our reunion, there's Michael. His sister came to our reunion 2 years ago in 2016 and told the story from the family's point of view. And when she was done, she laid out the stuff that had been in the grave with him for 14 years for us to see. And she told the story. The family had a powwow. Finally, all the siblings had their say, and then they said, "Mom, what do you think?" The father had deceased. And they asked Mom what she thought. She said, "Let's bring Michael home." And they went after the order to exhume, and they did bring Michael home. This is section 60. During Wreaths Across America. How many of you have ever purchased a wreath for Wreaths Across America? $15. Still 15, I think. You can get a wreath put on any grave in any national cemetery. Can't do it overseas at the American Battle Monuments Commission cemeteries, but at any of the national cemeteries you can.